Hello there, guys. My name is Siobhan Fallon. Welcome back to Custer's 7th Cavalry. Today we're going to talk about Captain Thomas Ward Custer. Tom Custer was the first soldier in American history to be awarded the Medal of Honor twice. He followed his brother from Civil War battlefields to post-Civil War unrest in Texas and then onto the fiery plains of the Indian Wars. He was also quite a ladies' man. There's a reason that General George Armstrong Custer said of his younger brother Tom, he should be the general and I should be the captain. All right, guys, let's learn more. Thanks for joining me.
Thomas Ward Custer was born on March 15, 1845 in New Rumley, Ohio. This was no easy life. Both his parents came to the marriage after the loss of their first spouses, and they brought young children from previous marriages with them. His father, Emmanuel, was a blacksmith in the town. His mother, Maria, was the daughter of a local tavern owner, and her first husband had been a farmer. George Armstrong Custer was the first surviving child born to Maria and Emmanuel's union. George was followed by Nevin, then Thomas, then Boston, and finally the baby, Margaret Emma or Maggie. There were 6 years between George and Tom. The blacksmith trade did not prove profitable for Emmanuel. They could only afford one bed for all those kids. So he tried his hand at farming, and he moved his family to a log cabin. Every child had to work that farm, even Tom, who was only 4 years old when they moved. Tom's mother, Maria, would later write, "Many times I have thought there were things that my children needed, and it caused me tears. Yet I consoled myself that I had done my best in making home comfortable. I was not fortunate enough to have wealth to make home beautiful, so I tried to fill up the empty spaces with little acts of kindness. It is sweet to toil for those we love." In 1851, Tom began walking the 1.5 miles to go to school each day. He was popular, but a terrible student in both grades and behavior. One of the things he was good at was finding ways to lock the teacher out of the one-room schoolhouse. Tom chewed tobacco, even as a boy. Once he snuck into the school early in the morning, drilled a hole under his desk, and then throughout the day he hid behind a book, chewing his tobacco, spitting it into the hole he cut in the floor, and then he'd cover it up with his foot. Of course, he got caught. Now, George had always been a mischievous student, but as their brother Nevin pointed out, Tom was always getting licked. Tom was also quite athletic, and especially at a game that was the precursor to baseball called town ball. George, who Tom and others called by his middle name of Armstrong, was about 6 years older. He moved in with his married half-sister who lived in Monroe, Michigan. The schools were better there. A few years later, in 1857, George managed to secure an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Tom was 12 at the time. In 1860, the subsistence farming in New Rumley was not enough for the Custer family, so they moved again, this time near Tontagoni Creek, Ohio, about 20 miles southwest of present-day Toledo. They lived on 40 acres of land near Maria's son by her first marriage, David Kirkpatrick. In March 1861, President Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States of America. The southern states began to succeed, and Cadet George Armstrong Custer wrote home to his family from West Point predicting war. That is what happened on April 12, 1861, when Confederate artillery fired on Fort Sumter, South Carolina. George Armstrong Custer graduated in a class much divided, with nearly half of his classmates dropping out to become officers within the Confederacy. George, of course, stayed true to the Union, and after graduating, he headed to the front lines to fight. Meanwhile, his brothers in Ohio wanted to enlist. Nevin volunteered first, but within a week was sent home because of an attack of rheumatism. Tom tried to enlist. At the nearest recruitment office, he lied. He said he was 18, and the recruiter said he knew for a fact that the boy was only 16. When Tom got home, he could tell by the smile on his dad's face that Emmanuel had been the one to warn the recruiter that his son was only 16 years old in advance. But by September 1861, Emmanuel relented and gave Tom permission to volunteer. Tom rode a few miles to the neighboring town and enlisted there. The official military paperwork lists him as 5'7", with blue eyes and sandy-colored hair, and as being 18 years old. Tom was now Private Custer of the 21st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Tom served 3 years as an enlisted man, taking part in the Western Theater's actions of Stones River, Chickamauga, the Atlanta Campaign, and others. He evidently excelled as he was tasked with the difficult role of serving as the escort for the likes of Brigadier General James Negley, General George Thomas, Brigadier General James Palmer, and even briefly for Major General Ulysses Grant. When George Armstrong Custer was promoted to Brevet Major General of Volunteers and was commanding the 3rd Cavalry Division of the Army of the Potomac, he began lobbying to have Tom transferred and promoted into the Officer Corps. This was no small task, as there were limited commissions available and commanders liked to promote among their own men, of course, rather than outsiders. Tom's regiment wasn't even in Custer's division. However, a stubborn George Custer finally managed to secure a commission for Tom on October 1864, B Company, 6th Michigan Cavalry, and Tom was assigned as his older brother's aide-de-camp. Tom met his brother's bride-to-be, Elizabeth, or Libby, a few days before the wedding in February 1864. Tom and George just happened to be on the same train as the family converged in Monroe, Michigan for the wedding. The Custer family was always playing pranks on each other, so George brought Tom home from the train station, and as Tom had changed quite a bit since the last time he'd been home, George tried to introduce him to the family as his aide, quote, Major Drew. No one was fooled. Libby, who had lost her own 3 siblings, as well as her mother, by the age of 13, loved Custer's family from the beginning, and she welcomed that whole unruly gang as her own, even when she was often the butt of their jokes and pranks. When she wasn't calling Tom the scamp, she referred to him as Brother Tom. Once back in the field again, and although George Custer had pulled strings to get his brother on his staff, he was not easy on him, and supposedly other members of Custer's staff commented to Libby that George was too hard on Tom. And being in the Michigan Brigade was already hard enough, certainly more dangerous duty than what Tom had left behind. The Michigan Brigade fought in every major campaign of the Army of the Potomac from June 1863 all the way to the Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. The Michigan Cavalry Brigade, that's the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th regiments, also suffered the heaviest casualties of any Union cavalry in the Civil War. They first gained national fame at Gettysburg under the leadership of, you guessed it, America's youngest Brigadier General of the U.S. Volunteers, George Armstrong Custer. This was the fight when Custer famously rushed ahead of his outnumbered troops and urged them on with, "Come on, you Wolverines!" It was also while leading the Michigan Cavalry Brigade that Custer created his own uniform and started wearing a bright red tie so that his troops would be able to see him wherever he was on the battlefield. His men emulated him and began to wear red ties of their own to show they belonged to his brigade, as did Tom. While I'm talking about visibility on the battlefield, let's quickly mention the importance of regimental flags, as it's not really something we think about today. The regimental flags were strategically important for every fight. Usually there was a color guard, which was a team of soldiers in charge of the flags. There would be 2 color bearers. One would hold the national flag, be it the U.S. or Confederate flag, and the other carried the regimental flag. Then there were usually 2 soldiers to guard these color bearers. Remember, there was no advanced communication at the time, certainly no satellite or cell phone or radio, and once a battle began, no one would be able to hear the commands or bugles, and there would be smoke and dust and just mass chaos. So it was supremely important that soldiers could see and follow their flags. The color bearers took their flags where their commanders ordered, right into the face of the enemy. They couldn't even run away themselves, or the entire regiment might follow them. So maintaining control over one's flags was key to every fight. But there was also an emotional significance to them. The regiments were often made up of soldiers from a local area or home state, so their flags were usually made by the women who came from the same places those very soldiers did, their wives, their mothers, their sisters. Therefore, every flag was linked with their own personal idea of home and everything these men were fighting to protect. Sometimes they'd sew the names of the battles they had fought into these flags, and the more tattered they were, the more these flags proved how much these men had endured. So no wonder soldiers were willing to, and often did, die to keep these flags safe. Okay, back to the Custer boys. Tom was by his brother's side during the first battle of the Shenandoah campaign on March 2, 1865, when Custer's cavalry took Waynesboro, Virginia. On March 3rd, Custer and his 3rd Cavalry Division marched into Charlottesville, the home of the University of Virginia, bringing the Emancipation Proclamation and freeing all those enslaved there. One 19-year-old student at an all-girls school wrote in her diary, "The long-expected hordes have come at last. They came shouting and galloping through town, waving their banners aloft." A delegation of professors from UVA met the Union troops under a flag of truce. One professor wrote, "We announced to these men, who were accompanied by a dirty-looking lieutenant, that no defense of Charlottesville was contemplated, and we requested protection for the university." By the way, that dirty-looking lieutenant was Tom Custer. Another witness wrote, "A good-looking officer rode up who announced himself as General Custer's adjutant." This too was Tom, and, quote, "good-looking" is a much kinder description than dirty. Custer moved his headquarters into the University of Virginia, and in this way, he saved it from being burned. Next came the fights at Dinwiddie Courthouse and Five Forks. It was at Five Forks on April 1st, 1865, where the Union cavalry fell back after an unsuccessful charge. Custer rallied the men for another, and then he led the next charge with Tom beside him. The color bearer carrying Custer's personal flag was shot, so Custer seized it himself and continued charging into enemy lines. The cavalry attacked the Confederate front while the infantry attacked the left flank, and they turned it. Confederate General George Pickett's entire force fell that day. But Tom's most glorious moments came later in April 1865. General Phil Sheridan's cavalry was sent to pursue the retreating army of General Robert E. Lee. George Custer and the 3rd Cavalry Division were in pursuit. They needed to stop the rebel cause from regrouping in any way. Tom had just turned 20 a couple of weeks earlier. On April 3rd, at Namazine Creek, the rebels had destroyed the bridge to stop the Union, and they fortified a crossroads. General Robert E. Lee told them to hold that position at all costs. Union Army Colonel William Wells, who was commanding Custer's 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Cavalry Division, led Custer's offensive with his New York and Vermont volunteers. As 3 regiments of Confederate North Carolina cavalry got into position to block the route, Tom rode to the front of Wells' brigade. Wells ordered a charge. With them, Tom raced across the open ground and leapt over a rebel barricade. The air was torn apart by bullets. Tom saw a Confederate color bearer, and he seized the flag he was holding. Then Tom managed to order the rebels to drop their weapons. He took 3 officers and 11 soldiers prisoner. Tom's horse had been shot, so he took one from the enemy. Tom returned to the Union rear with his prisoners, his new horse, and his captured battle flag. George Custer wrote his new wife, Libby, "You have already heard how God blesses us with victory. With my 3 brigades of cavalry, I fought and whipped 6 brigades of infantry and 2 brigades of cavalry. Tom, in the most gallant manner, led the charge of the 2nd Brigade and captured the battle flag of the 2nd North Carolina Cavalry and also the color bearer. He also captured 2 officers and 12 men. None of our men were near him. His horse was shot. He also had a horse shot 2 days ago in a fight. Tom is always in the advance. And that wasn't the end of it. On April 6th, the Union cavalry was still in pursuit of the crumbling Confederacy. The spring rains made travel slow for both sides, but the Union army could cut loose from their wagons, and they began to gain on the Confederates, who could not leave their wagons behind to be captured. The Union caught up with the rebels near Sailor's Creek. The Confederates had no choice but to prepare to fight. Tom and George Custer were in the front, of course. George Custer, using the quick and aggressive skills that made him famous, saw one rebel battery preparing to fire. He immediately ordered a charge and managed to capture 9 cannons, as well as 800 men, 300 wagons, before the Confederates were able to position themselves or their deadly cannon fire. Meanwhile, more troops from the Union side accumulated in front of other entrenched Confederates. Colonel Henry Capehart commanded the 3rd Brigade of Custer's 3rd Cavalry Division. They were in the advance and moved forward on command. Tom rode up next to Colonel Capehart. As the cannon started firing, Capehart signaled the charge, and Tom burst in front, raced across the clearing between the 2 sides, and once more his horse leapt over the rebel barricades, with Tom shooting away the whole time. As the Confederate line tried to regroup, Tom glimpsed an enemy battle flag, so he charged the color bearer. Wrote Colonel Capehart about Tom capturing that flag. It was in a charge made by my brigade at Sailor's Creek, Virginia, against General Ewell's corps. Having crossed the line of temporary works in the flank of the road, we were confronted by a supporting line. It was from the 2nd line that Tom wrested the colors single-handedly, and only a few paces to my left. As he approached the colors, he received a shot in the face, which knocked him back on his horse, but in a moment he was upright in the saddle. Reaching out his right arm, he grasped the flag while the color bearer reeled. The bullet from Tom's revolver must have pierced his heart. As he was falling, Captain Custer wrenched the standard from his grip and bore it away in triumph. Tom then held the banner high and turned his horse around and headed straight for the Union lines. One Union officer saw him coming back and screamed, "For God's sakes, Tom, furl that flag or they'll fire on you." Well, the 20-year-old did not listen, but continued to ride straight at his commander, who was, of course, the older brother he so admired. Tom waved those captured colors, yelling, "Armstrong, the damned rebels have shot me, but I've got my flag." George Custer had recently seen another of his aides shot in the face and die from the wound. He quickly told Tom, who was just drenched in his own blood, to see the surgeon in the rear. Well, Tom refused, and he started to turn back to the front lines. George had to put his brother under arrest to stop him from continuing to fight, and Tom was brought to the rear under a guard. George Custer's chief of staff later said, quote, "Tom on that day fought like a lion." The Battle of Sailor's Creek was the last gasp of General Lee's army. The Union captured 25% of the Army of Northern Virginia that day. Just a few days later, on April 9th, 1865, General Lee and his army surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. George Custer was there, but Tom was not. He was healing from his wound. Tom was in Monroe, Michigan, recuperating. Libby described his injury as a black patch planted in the midst of a very new and downy beard. It was an ornament in our eyes for all the time it covered his wound. He gave his red necktie, covered in his own dried blood, to his parents. It was a miracle that Tom survived, that the bullet ultimately created a flesh wound in the soft tissue rather than crashing through his skull or spine, or that his face wasn't totally disfigured. Also remember, we didn't even have antibiotics then. Penicillin wasn't discovered until 1928. If you want a really sobering example of the sacrifice soldiers made during the Civil War, so many brave men who fought to keep America united and to end slavery, please Google Civil War injuries and take a look at what these young men went through for their country. The images are too horrible for me to show here. All this to say that clearly Tom Custer had his own share of Custer's luck. The scar would remain on his face, his red badge of courage, for the rest of his life. It doesn't really show in photos, but that scar was prominent enough that even in 1876, the Arikara Indian Scouts, who I mention and talk about quite a bit in my Bloody Knife video, referred to him as, quote, Tom, the one with a scar on his face. 5 days after Lee surrendered and the war was officially over, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. Tom received the highest award from the United States Army, the Medal of Honor, for his actions of bravery and valor in capturing those enemy flags, as well as enemy prisoners. The first he received for his actions at Namazine Church on April 24th. Then he was awarded his second on May 22nd, 1865. Thomas Ward Custer was the first man in American military history and the only Union soldier in the Civil War to receive this medal twice. And it's a rare honor to this day. Only 19 men have received the Medal of Honor twice in the history of America. On May 23rd, there was a parade for the triumphant Army of the Potomac, who marched through Washington, D.C. General Phil Sheridan's Cavalry Brigade was in front, led by the 3rd Cavalry Division. Tom was there wearing these medals. It must have been one of the proudest moments of his life. George Custer wrote this description of Tom, which could also be applied to himself. You might think that Tom lacks caution and judgment. On the contrary, he possesses both in an unusual degree. His excellent judgment tells him when to press the enemy and when to be moderate. Of all of my staff officers, he is the quickest in perceiving at a glance the exact state of things. This trait frequently excited comment. When at first he joined me, I was anxious concerning his conduct. But now I am as proud of him as can be, as a soldier and as a brother. The Civil War may have been over, but not all the soldier enlistments were. There were renegade groups of Confederate soldiers who would not surrender to the federal government, and they were in Texas. General Ulysses Grant told General Sheridan, "Your duty is to restore Texas and that part of Louisiana held by the enemy." So Sheridan sent, you know it, General George Custer to Texas. Tom was with him, as was Custer's young wife, Libby. It was not a pretty trip. Besides alligators, mosquitoes, chiggers, scorpions, snakes, and malaria, the soldiers of this new division wanted to go home to their families. This was not the 3rd Cavalry Division George and Tom knew so well. George and Tom feared mutiny. Tom started to wear his sidearm at all times. They spent Christmas of 1865 posted in Austin, Texas. Tom, who had been trying to teach himself to play the piano, was given a Jew's harp as a gift, with a note that said, "Give the piano a rest." As this is the sound a Jew's harp makes, I'm guessing it didn't take long before they all begged Tom to get back on the piano. In January 1866, the Custer men learned they were being mustered out of the service. They returned to Monroe for a few months while they decided on their future. The Army greatly downsized after the Civil War, and commissions in the regular Army were hard to come by, though Tom kept himself busy. Libby wrote, "Brother Tom has spent the summer skipping from flower to flower, tasting the sweets of all the rosebud garden of girls in our pretty town. I had already taken to myself a good deal of the mothering of this wild boy, and began to worry, as is the custom of mothers, over the advances of a venturesome woman who was no longer young and playing for high stakes. It was no small matter to me, as I knew Tom would live with us always if he could manage to do so, and my prospective sister-in-law would be my nearest companion. Lad as he was, he escaped and preserved his heart in an unbroken condition during the summer. Tom may have fathered an illegitimate son at this time, but more on the ins and outs of Tom's love life in Part 2. In 1866, George and Tom were busy mapping out their military futures. George Custer received a commission as lieutenant colonel of the newly formed 7th Cavalry that would be posted at Fort Riley, Kansas, which was a promotion from his regular Army rank of captain. Tom was fortunate to receive a commission as a first lieutenant with the 1st U.S. Infantry. Positions were scarce, and he beat out plenty of men who had been brevet major generals during the Civil War. But 2 Medal of Honors had to count for something, and he had received a personal endorsement from General Phil Sheridan. Not long afterwards, Tom was transferred to the 7th Cavalry and reunited with George and Libby. Tom reported at Fort Riley in November 1866. On December 21, 1866, Captain William Fetterman and 80 soldiers were led into a trap, ambushed and killed, and then the dead were mutilated at nearby Fort Kearny, near the eastern foothills of the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming Territory. The official military report described the soldiers' bodies as eyes torn out and laid on rocks, noses cut off, ears cut off, chins hewn off, entrails taken out and exposed, arms taken out of sockets, private parts severed and indecently placed on the person. Now, the 7th Cavalry was made up of some very experienced and battle-hardened Civil War veterans. They received brevet ranks, they'd been wounded, they'd been prisoners of war, they lost countless classmates, friends, and family members, and especially those who served in the Eastern Theater at the Battle of something like Gettysburg. They'd seen nearly catastrophic mass casualties. Well, the Fetterman Massacre proved that being out on the plains was not going to be a picnic. They had a new enemy who fought by different rules, and it must have been sobering for the wives and family members, too, to learn how Fort Kearny had been besieged and under attack. This also meant the 7th would be involved in tracking down these Lakota and Cheyenne in what would be known as the Hancock Campaign. The 7th set out on this campaign at the end of March 1867. Tom, soon after arriving in Kansas, had been struck down by break-bone fever, and he was ill for 3 months. He wasn't well enough to join his comrades when they left on their campaign. Instead, he remained at Riley. Libby was probably pretty happy to have him around, as there was a prairie fire that burned across the plain, and only a miraculous change of wind saved the post, and then there was an earthquake. Tom rejoined his command in mid-May. He was 22 years old now, and George Custer was 27 years old. The 7th found themselves in multiple skirmishes and the victim of surprise attacks. The Indians did not seem to have trouble finding them, but the 7th just couldn't track down the Indians. They were always one step behind. And besides continued attacks on stagecoaches and forts and homesteads, Captain Lewis Hamilton, Captain Albert Barnitz, and Captain William Weiner Cook all fended off attacks with the aggressive Lakota and Cheyenne in the area. The frustrations were felt by everyone, and things steadily went from worse to worse. On January 8, 1867, in camp, Major Wycliffe Cooper, who had been a decorated officer during the Civil War, shot himself in his tent and died. He was an alcoholic, and the story goes that he had run out of whiskey. He left behind a pregnant wife. The grueling and fruitless campaign continued, covering over 1,000 miles in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado, and then back again for months and months at the height of summer. Maybe it's no wonder that the 7th Cavalry was dealing with a high rate of soldier desertion at the same time. Author Jeff Broome has done really great work in his book Indian Raids and Massacres, and he examines the actions of the 7th Cavalry during this Hancock campaign. He points out that 11% of the enlisted men in the 7th Cavalry, 34 out of 338 men deserted. So on the afternoon of July 7th, while taking a break during the march, when Custer witnessed 5 soldiers riding off on horseback, that means they stole the horses, and 6 running off on foot, the frustrated commander ordered the bugler to sound recall. The deserters only ran faster. Custer turned to Tom and he said, "I want you to get on your horse and go after those deserters and shoot them down," which is exactly what Tom, Major Joel Elliott, and Lieutenant William Weiner Cook did. These officers rode down the running men and they shouted, "Halt!" Supposedly, one of the deserters raised a gun, and that's when the officers opened fire. 3 men were wounded. They were put under arrest, and a wagon came out and got them, and they were brought back to camp. George Custer said loudly to the surgeon that he was not allowed to treat the wounded men. Custer later supposedly pulled the surgeon aside and told him he could give these guys medical attention, but Custer didn't want any of the other soldiers to know about it. Well, one of the wounded men died. The 2 others lived, but not one soldier deserted from the 7th Cavalry after that. And a few days later, on July 12, 1867, the 7th came upon the massacred men of Lieutenant Kidder. He had been sent with 11 men to deliver dispatches from General Sherman to Custer. Custer described the scene, quote, "The mangled bodies of poor Kidder and his party, yet so brutally hacked and disfigured as to be beyond recognition save as human beings. Every individual of the party had been scalped and his skull broken." On July 13th, the 7th Cavalry arrived at Fort Wallace. Custer had wanted to meet with General Hancock, but learned that Hancock wasn't there. It was called the Hancock Campaign, but General Hancock had gone to the much nicer and much safer Fort Leavenworth. Custer found Fort Wallace a mess. He learned from Captain Albert Barnitz that the fort had been twice attacked just in the last couple of days. This is the same post that, at the end of June, had been attacked by 300 Cheyenne, leaving 7 soldiers dead and 7 wounded. More recently, cholera hit. 12 enlisted men had died and 30 were sick. The continuous attacks on the stagecoach route by the Lakota and Cheyenne had shut down all communications and provisions from the outside world. Medical supplies were low, there was hardly any food, and there wasn't any hay for the horses. Custer had enough. The 27-year-old took a small detachment of men, including Tom, and they rode all the way to Fort Harker, where in the middle of the night, he telegraphed what had happened to Lieutenant Kidder and his party, and he arranged for supplies to go out to Fort Wallace. And then, with the sleepy verbal approval of General Smith, who had been woken up in the middle of the night, Custer then raced off to his wife Libby at Fort Riley. He ultimately traveled 275 miles in 67 hours, and Custer would be court-martialed because of it. It's thought that General Hancock, who had been widely criticized in the press for the summer campaign, especially for the $150,000 a day it was costing without any positive results, that he may have pushed for Custer's court-martial in order to deflect blame from himself. The charges brought against Custer were that he had been absent without leave from his command because he left Fort Wallace without the proper authority, and that his behavior was prejudicial to good order and military discipline. Many historians trace the future division within the 7th Cavalry to the Battle of the Washita, but I think it was this moment in 7th Cavalry history that created the discord we read about so much later on. The 7th was divided into camps, those who were friendly to Custer and who might testify favorably, and those who would not. Lieutenant Charles Brewster wrote Custer during the proceedings, "There is not another officer here at Fort Wallace you can count on, neither Elliott, Myers, Robbins, Barnitz, Commanger, Hale, Jackson, nor Levy, nor Coates either. Hamilton is friendly to you. Keogh is not. West is very bitter, it seems, and you may expect the worst from him. He was right about Captain Robert West. West, who Custer had once placed under arrest for drunkenness on duty, added additional charges to those leveled against Custer during the court-martial. Men of West's company had been shot on July 7th, and he proffered charges of conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline against Custer because he had ordered officers to shoot the deserters without trial. Now, before the Civil War, deserters from the Army were flogged. After 1861, tattoos or branding were also used. The maximum U.S. penalty for desertion in wartime is still, to this day, death, but this punishment was last applied in 1845. The official code of military justice states, any person found guilty of desertion or attempt to desert shall be punished, if the offense is committed in time of war, by death or other such punishment as a court-martial may direct. But of course, there had been no court-martial trial for those soldiers on July 7th who deserted. Witnesses included Major Joel Elliott, Lieutenant William Weiner Cook, and others, as well as Lieutenant Thomas Ward Custer. Tom was a witness for the prosecution. He testified to having shot at the deserters himself, but then was allowed to withdraw that admission so as not to incriminate himself. He said that the night before, on July 6th, he had had 10 deserters from his one company alone. He also testified that there was not one soldier in the command who deserted after the incident. The quartermaster, a sergeant, testified that had these men not been shot, there would have been a number more who were planning on deserting the next night. George Custer was found guilty of every charge, and he was suspended from rank and pay for 1 year. General Hancock was relieved of his command by General Sherman and replaced by General Phil Sheridan. While Custer was serving out part of his year-long punishment, General Sheridan let him live in his home at Fort Leavenworth, which in itself showed what he thought, at least, of Custer's guilty verdict. Tom spent the winter of 1867 to 68 with George and Libby Custer, and Libby would write about all the social events that they attended during this time. But whatever happy face the Custers put on the guilty verdict, it must have been a troubling one for all of them. George and Tom had served in the Civil War, where it had been a victory just to survive, yet Tom and George emerged as heroes. In 1865, both of them were at the pinnacle of their Army careers. And yet here we are a couple of years later, and they are suddenly at the lowest. Where once Custer's men wore red neckties to identify with him, now they were literally running away from his command, and he didn't even know what officers he could trust. And Tom not only shoots down deserters, but then he has to testify at the court-martial of his brother, the brother he adores. When Tom returns to divided 7th Cavalry with Major Joel Elliott, now the acting commander, his brother, George Custer, is suspended for a year without pay. So all was not right with the 7th Cavalry, and it will only get worse.
All right, guys, I'm going to leave it there for today. Please come back and watch part 2 when we'll talk about the daring capture of the Lakota warrior Rain in the Face. Also, whether or not Tom really had that shootout with Wild Bill Hickok, his obsession with rattlesnakes, his love affairs, and of course everything up to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Stay tuned for the next slide that has the book lists, credits, and I'd really love if you guys click that notification bell, subscribe, leave me a comment. Just do what you've been doing. You're the best. You're all so wonderful. And I hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.